Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Is the broadcast okay? Can you hear me well?
Hi, Raquel.
Yes.
We can hear you, but we cannot see you. Could you please turn your camera, please? Turn on your camera, please. Or Isabella, Gabriel, could you please turn our cameras, please? Turn on our cameras.
Now,
now we can see you. Thank you, Raquel.
Okay.
You can start.
You're welcome. So today it's a great pleasure to be here again for our first Zoom Cartography of 2023. I am Raquel Souza, a student from Unicamp, and I'm also a participant of the Cartographic Syntax Laboratory, La Casa, led by Professor Aquiles Pescari Neto, who is present on this broadcast. Also here today are the participants of Núcleo de Estudos Gramaticais, NEG, from Wolfe, led by Professor Sandra Quarezemin, who is also here on this broadcast. And we would like to remind you that Zoom Cartography is offered by these two laboratories, and together we are pleased to be making these wonderful cartographic meetings happen. Our guest today is Professor Sam Wolfe, professor from the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology, and Phonetics from University of Oxford. His research focuses on understanding the nature of grammatical variation, acquisition, and change, with particular interest in standard and non-standard Romance languages. His talk is entitled "The Loss of V2 in Romance, a Cartographic Perspective." Remind you that after his presentation, we will have some time for discussion. So please, if you have some questions, you can submit them on the YouTube chat, or you can also send them to the email that will be available on the YouTube chat too. And just please remember to write your name, your country, and institution. And now, Professor Wolfe, welcome to Zoom Cartografia, and you can please start your talk.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. My talk today is really focused on discussing an aspect of the history of the Romance languages that may be very familiar to lots of you, but I think nevertheless is worth revisiting through the particular lens of how the verb second property is lost. So I'm going to try now to share my screen, and you can all shout out if it's not working. That's working okay?
Yeah, it's working perfectly.
Fantastic. And crucially, I'm looking at the loss of verb second in Romance today through a cartographic lens. Verb second, there are phenomena we can all think of where viewing them in cartographic terms changes our perspective on the phenomenon in question slightly, maybe moderately, or a lot. And verb second is undoubtedly in the last camp. It's something where if we start to consider V2 through a cartographic lens, quite a lot of our assumptions, which we may have had in more classic terminology, are rendered in some ways problematic. And I'm going to suggest today that, in fact, the story about how verb second goes on to be lost is even more complex if you look at it through a cartographic lens. So I'm going to start with a bit of quite general background on verb second and its synchronic correlates, and also some of the diachronic and typological story as well. So verb second, although this is changing to some degree, has classically been studied with reference to the Germanic languages, and Dutch and German in some of the classic publications on which standard formal theories of verb second are based feature very, very heavily. Now, one of the things that's really changed since the 70s and 80s is that the acknowledged typology of verb second grammars is far larger than originally envisaged. So there's a great deal now of historical work on the Germanic languages that shows fairly compellingly that the verb second property that we observe today in most modern Germanic languages, though notably not English, was a feature of the historical syntax of a number of those languages. So there's quite a large comparative literature on early Germanic, as well as a very large literature on the history of English and how the verb second constraint there has changed over time. There was some early interest in medieval Romance, in particular in the work of Paula Beninca, but also kind of explosion of what you might think of, I guess, as kind of second wave research on medieval romance in recent years. And it's also worth saying, although still a lot we don't understand about the Rhetoromance languages, there is a growing body of research on Rhetoromance as well today, which crucially are the only modern Romance languages today which still retain a full verb second syntax. Now, while verb second is what I guess I would call a semi-stable feature of most modern Germanic languages today, what's potentially interesting about the property is the fact that it has remained stable in a number of languages for a very large period of time, but we also observe a lot of verb second loss. So as I just said, the Rhetoromance languages today are the only Romance languages to retain V2, but nevertheless, verb second is in most standard approaches assumed to characterize all the medieval Romance languages. Verb second also characterizes a number of important stages in the history of English, but is lost, and also the history of a number of Celtic languages where it's been lost and still retained today in modern Breton. So the reason I'm kind of presenting these basic facts is that actually understanding verb second loss is kind of important because it's a major linguistic change affecting core clausal word order and a number of other related properties, which actually characterizes the historical syntax of a very large number of languages. Now, the really important observation, though, is that a lot of what we thought we knew about these languages has changed quite a lot quite recently. And that, by implication, means that we need to change our formal account and our formal account of how verb second is lost. So taking a step back, what would we actually say verb second in Romance really is? Well, there's a very traditional view. And of course, one of the things about, as with all formal accounts, is that what we say changes somewhat each time the theory evolves. But a very early quote you've got there from Dane Beston is a very nice example where the standard account is that you have one rule or one operation which moves, or in earlier terminology, sometimes referred to just as fronting your finite verb, and an additional step where you front a phrasal constituent. And crucially, in that very early account, the alternation between the complementizer and the finite verb is fairly central and is assumed to account for the notable matrix embedded asymmetries that you see in those well-studied V2 systems. And if you reformulate that in slightly more recent terms, basically what you have is V to C movement, followed by an additional step that fronts an XP to spec CP. Now, this account has a number of advantages, and I'm not going to go through all of them now, but one advantage, of course, is that it accurately predicts that your verb is more often than not second in verb second languages, because ultimately you are just leaving one vacant position in the specifier position of C before the finite verb. The second point is it fairly neatly deals with languages where you have very sharp matrix embedded asymmetries, because if you assume you only have one position that can be targeted by complementizers, a crucial result of that is that you will then see very sharp clause type asymmetries where you have a complementizer and you want to move your verb into that position. But cartography comes along and, at least initially, although I'm going to suggest it's very beneficial, ends up complicating things. Because we have gone from a very restrictive theory where ultimately, if you want to maintain the core intuition that verb second is a left peripheral operation, you basically have one head position and one phrasal position you can move your verb to a far more complex state of affairs, where even if you make relatively prudent assumptions, and many cartographers would consider the assumption you have fin, focus, topic, force, and frame as quite prudent, you suddenly have a number of positions which theoretically could be the target of verb movement and could be the target of that phrasal merger operation as well. And this has, as a result, given way to a number of different accounts of verb second in cartographic terms. So a very prominent account, which features in a lot of the Romance literature, is what you might think of as a focus-centric approach to verb second. This is the idea that focus, which is often described in these works as a sort of operator layer, is the eventual locus of verb second. So you move your finite verb to foc, And ultimately, the majority, although this isn't made completely explicit in all these treatments, you assume the majority of the constituents which satisfy verb second are moving to the focus layer. Now, there's an important caveat here, which is that a number of the scholars who are proponents of this view do understand focus in a somewhat more neutral term than one might classically do. So the idea is not necessarily that all those constituents are, in discourse pragmatic terms, focal, but rather that they reach the left periphery via movement. And that's been put forward most prominently, it's worth saying, for Islo-Romance varieties, but there are also focus V2 accounts of French. Another idea which goes back actually to really very early work in the 90s by Liliana Hagemann is the idea that Finn is the locus of verb second. So this is put forward also in Cardinaletti and Roberts' treatment of the verb second property, and a number of different accounts of medieval Romance syntax, also a few accounts of historical Germanic syntax as well. And this makes a lot of sense intuitively because, crucially, verbal finiteness is something which figures very, very heavily in a lot of early accounts of verb second, particularly in the Germanic literature in the late 80s and early 90s. The idea that maybe a major point of distinction between verb second and SVO systems is that the locus of verbal finiteness is in some sense higher structurally in verb second grammars. And then finally, and this is really a more recent idea, and by more recent, I think it goes back, actually, it's first put forward in 2000, but that's relatively recent, relatively speaking, that force can be the locus of V2, so that you might have very high verb second languages. This is an idea which is put forward to capture the strictness of modern German verb second in Frascarelli and Hinterhutzel. It's been put forward probably most prominently by Cecilia Poletto in her work on Rhetoromance varieties synchronically. Also by Alain Rouvray for Old French, and by myself for a number of early medieval Romance varieties. Sorry, late medieval Romance varieties. So if we try and sort of schematize this, put simply, the verb can target a number of different projections. And that crucially will make different predictions about what you expect to see before the finite verb. So if you have a very low verb second grammar where you target Finn, the prediction that you will make, and this is fairly simple to get your head around, is that you're going to have lots of left peripheral space. So you will be able to merge quite a lot of constituents to the left of your finite verb. However, the further ultimately that you move up the tree, the more you expect to see restrictions on what you can front. And if you assume, I'm sort of without justification, though I can come onto it on question time, assuming that you can't have frame verb second languages. But if you assume that as high as you can go is force, really that restricts quite a lot what you're going to be able to get pre-verbally. So the important take-home message for our purposes talking about verb second loss, which I'm now going to come on to, is that it means we really have to move on from asking a fairly simple question, which is whether a grammar is V2, to asking what kind of verb second it is. And crucially, if we're thinking in diachronic terms, we might well make the prediction that languages can move from one point on the typology to another. So this would be a classic case of what Roberts and Rousseau call upwards reanalysis, where you might have a language where verb movement and what you might loosely term EPP effects find their locus on Finn, but this might be reanalyzed upwards by acquirers onto force. And likewise, you could also imagine a scenario which may become relevant to what we talk about today, where you see downwards reanalysis as well. So when we just focus in on Romance, it's a key finding of early diachronic syntax that the Romance languages had a verb second syntax. And you have an example there from French, where crucially what you see is that your verbal form, your verb there, avoir, and your postposed pronominal form, il, is sandwiched between adverbials, which we might, and a past participle, which we might infer from that the pronominal subject is in quite a high position in the T layer, and this means that we're dealing with V to C movement. And crucially, you also see lots of examples of this phenomenon in a number of languages where you have nominal subjects as well. So the core evidence for the medieval Romance verb second hypothesis really comes from a number of empirical observations, extensive so-called verb subject inversion, a vital point to make here, I even called that subject postposed, but of course, really, this isn't really inversion as such. It's just the subject isn't necessarily climbing to a position higher than your finite verb. The idea you have an unrestricted pre-field, so it's not just subjects that can occur pre-verbally, and sharp matrix embedded asymmetries. And those are kind of, if you like, the headline diagnostics which have been applied. And I think that it's worth saying there's further evidence which supports the V2 account, which has emerged really in relatively recent times. One is that when early work in the 80s starts on medieval Romance, to some extent, the medieval Romance languages look a bit exceptional within a V2 typology. And what I mean by this is they show undoubtedly certain properties in common with the better studied modern Germanic systems, but also quite a lot of points of divergence. And I think that that overall perspective is rather different today. A lot of the medieval Romance languages have a lot in common with non-standard Germanic varieties, historical Germanic varieties, historical Celtic varieties, where we see really quite similar properties in terms of the clausal syntax. I also think there's an additional motivation for the verb second account, which is that we have a fairly robust now diachronic account for the evolution of verb second. So both early on in terms of how verb second might plausibly have emerged out of the predominantly SOV system we see in Latin, but also for some languages, how the verb second property might change within the medieval period. And I think we now understand a couple of other things as well about variation. So one point is really on synchronic variation, and this becomes significant to verb second loss. So there's a very early proposal by Paolo Benincà that you have more relaxed and stricter medieval Romance verb second systems. And I've revisited that in some work and said, well, we can map this relaxed versus strict terminology onto a thin versus force typology, so that you have low verb second in some languages, which yields a descriptively more relaxed syntax, and a stricter verb second typology of languages where the locus is force. And this partially corresponds, and I'm very happy to talk about this a bit in question time. I haven't got so much on it on the slide deck today, to the north-south axis in typological terms, which has been proposed by Zamboni and also Adam Ledgway, where a number of what you might think of as southern Romance varieties show certain properties such as extensive argument fronting and typically fairly widespread null arguments, which their northern counterparts don't. And there is potentially some evidence that this may map on to essentially how strict you get in terms of being a verb second system in the medieval period. Also, in terms of diachrony, one of the dominant accounts of late Latin clausal structure put forward by Adam Ledgway suggests basically that late Latin has what you might think of as half the verb second constraint. And this is interpreted to mean it has systematic V to C movement or V to fin movement, but does not necessarily have obligatory fronting of XPs to the left periphery. And in a 2015 paper, I put forward a similar claim for Old Sardinian. There's also fairly robust evidence for French, some Occitan varieties, some Northern Italo-Romance varieties, and possibly also some varieties of later Old Spanish for a slightly stricter verb second stage there as well. So you see diachronic variation where a thin V2 system changes into a force V2 system. So where does this leave us? Because I haven't actually discussed verb second loss yet. Well, it leads us with a family of languages where a C-related head, put fairly loosely, bears a verb movement triggering feature and also a phrasal movement triggering edge feature, yielding verb second. And I'd like to propose minimally that based on the evidence we have so far, these features can be associated with a high head, force, yielding a fairly strict verb second system, or a low head, fin, which yields a more relaxed one. And crucially, this typology yields kind of quite a neat parallel, really, with what we now know about the modern Romance languages, where we know that saying, oh, well, you know, Brazilian Portuguese and modern Peninsular Spanish, oh, and French are SVO is not necessarily a very helpful generalization, and that you need to ask an awful lot more questions than that. And to some extent, of course, there are always restrictions when dealing with historic corpora. We're able to ask kind of more fine-grained questions which parallel those of the medieval languages. So this also leaves us with a picture where we have certain common properties. So verb subject in inverted commas inversion, a large proportion of non-subjects in the left periphery, and also fairly sharp matrix embedded asymmetries. But what you also see, and this is quite significant, are certain points of variation between the languages. And I'm going to come on to that today. And I've identified 4 there, 2 of which we've already talked about: the potential variable locus of verb movement and the potentially variable locus of EPP effects. But there are also 2 points. One is that the idea that the pragmatic value of the preverbal constituent could vary across Romance. And that's been put forward in various work, in particular on the licensing of preverbal information focus, which seems to be a major point of contrast between the varieties, in fact, just as it is amongst modern Romance languages today. And secondly, the proportion of non-linear verb second orders. So put simply, how much verb first you have and how much verb third you have. And that's also a point of variation amongst the languages which you might consider to be robust full verb second systems in, say, the 12th and 13th centuries. So this leaves us with kind of a very, very basic clausal map like the following, where what you might say is V to fin movement is a point of commonality in medieval Romance, just as in modern Romance V to T movement as a cover term typically is. Verb subject inversion, again, a point of commonality. An unrestricted prefield, basically showing that your prefield is not sub P, it's not spec TP, it's the left periphery. And also matrix embedded asymmetries, which fall out fairly naturally if you assume that in at least a subcase or a subclass of cases, your verb and your complementizers are ultimately trying to target the same position. And it also seems like we have 2 types of verb second system. So we have the fin verb second system, where you have a full range of left peripheral projections, you get quite a lot of verb third or greater, and also force V2 systems, where you have possibly more restrictions on the nature of the prefield, and probably fewer verb third orders as well. Now, some of this, what I've said so far, many of you will be familiar with, but it is in some ways necessary background for what I'm then going to say about how these systems break down. So the area I'd like to focus on now is this point I've identified on the slide with the arrow, which is if in at least some languages you see a progression like the one in blue, where you go from SOV to VSO to fin V2, and at least in some languages to force V2, what happens next? Do you just jump to being an SVO system with certain verb second relics? Or do you have a kind of intermediary phase? And crucially, it's not a novel claim of mine that there's an intermediary phase. So there is work specifically on classical Portuguese, which many of you will be familiar with, and some of you on the call may well have even done yourselves, which has claimed that there is a kind of intermediary phase where the grammar shows some properties in common with other verb second grammars and some slight differences. But actually, it's worth saying, although there is that literature on classical Portuguese, for very many Romance languages, there's actually been relatively little on verb second loss since the heyday of research on this issue in the 1990s, where there was a huge amount. And a lot of this research, crucially, really focused, largely inspired by work by David Lightfoot, amongst others, on the idea you might have a single cue, a single piece of input, which would lead, if you weren't exposed to it enough, it would lead to the breakdown of the system. And there are a couple of reasons for revisiting that assumption, I think. One is just what I've laid out so far, that much bigger body of typological data we have today, which casts some of those assumptions into doubt. And also, I think the fact that quite a number of us now might not be so comfortable with that idea that you might have a very small number of pre-specified cues, which would lead to verb second loss in and of themselves. So really, how you lose verb second, I'd like to suggest, is quite a key piece of the medieval Romance word order puzzle. So some of the questions we might ask are the following. Is there a single trigger for loss? And if there isn't, what are some of the multiple factors which might condition loss? Another point, which I've kind of hinted at so far, is does the refined verb second typology developed in recent years actually help us understand a bit more why an acquirer might have eventually favored SVO? And furthermore, do cartographic considerations actually call for a really quite significant reappraisal of this idea? You might have a very small number of cues which lead to the acquisition of verb second or even the breakdown of verb second. So the basic question is as follows. If you have a child, how do they go from what's on the left of the screen to what's on the right of the screen? So I'm going to talk through two case studies. One is looking at Middle French, and one is looking at later Old Veneton. And Middle French actually, and I think they're quite an interesting pair because they're both Romance varieties, but they're both Northern Romance varieties with a number of properties in common. But they're also quite different. Middle French did get discussed quite a lot in the 1990s. Later Old Veneton hardly at all. And in fact, Veneton syntax in general is something where our knowledge is growing all the time. This is a spoiler, but my core proposal today is that there is no single trigger for the loss of verb second, and likely no single cue for its emergence or maintenance either. And what you see is a gradual build-up of data, which ultimately undermines evidence for those two key operations of XP fronting and verb movement. So let's start by talking a little bit about Middle French. So French is undoubtedly one of the best studied medieval Romance languages, very, very large literature. And there are really two dominant approaches to verb second loss that have already been published in the literature. One is the idea that French loses verb second because you lose null subjects. And the idea is basically this, that what you see is an increase in pre-verbal overt subjects satisfying verb second, I hasten to add, and then that just undermines evidence that this is really a left peripheral position and not a position inside the T domain. The second approach is the idea that you have some kinds of verb third, which are the wrong kind, or what I'm slightly tongue-in-cheek going to call naughty verb third, which undermine evidence for verb second. And the discussion I'm going to have today is based on the analysis of 3 15th century texts, which haven't been looked at so much before. So on the loss of null subjects, very familiar to lots of people, I'm sure, the long-established overlap between the notions of topic and subjecthood, though absolutely not absolute. In a lot of verb second languages today, like modern German, it's often observed that subjects actually act as kind of default topics in verb second clauses. You see a lot of initial subjects satisfying verb second. And David Lightfoot, in his work in the 90s and early 2000s, suggested that child acquirers need approximately 30% of the input to be non-subject initial rather than SVO in order to successfully acquire verb second. So this hypothesis would basically have it that as French progressively loses null subjects, more and more overt subjects appear pre-verbally in the left periphery as verb second satisfiers, and they eventually become so numerous that a more economical reanalysis of the data is that you're dealing with an SVO system where the subjects are not moving to the left periphery at all. They are clause internal, they're within sub-P or TP. The naughty verb third approach is basically sort of has as a subtext that verb second is somehow linked to linear ordering. And the idea might be that a build-up of verb third of the type you see in 2 ultimately ends up undermining evidence to the acquirer that what you've got there is 2 left peripheral XPs in favor of analysis where you assume that you have 1 left peripheral XP and then a subject which is clause internal. And there are problems with both of these approaches. A really big one on null subjects is just that the vast majority of Romance languages remained null subject systems or partial null subject systems, but still lose verb second. So the idea there is something magical about losing null subjects and therefore losing verb second is just quite problematic on comparative grounds. The other point, and this is a bit more nuanced, on the one hand, we can see the intuitive sense in this account of the naughty verb third, but at the same time, it seems like certain V2 grammars with relatively low verb movement, so to fin, actually have quite a lot of verb third and remain relatively stable as verb second systems across several centuries. So if there really was something so wrong with having verb third and fourth in general, you would predict that those stages would be very, very very, very brief indeed. But historically, I think the record suggests there maybe not. So there's a complexity there. So what can Middle French tell us? Well, when you analyze these texts, you see that there is a range of constituent fronting. So if you look at just cases where you have this verb in second position, you get somewhere between 73% and around 46% of initial non-subjects. So crucially, there's not a vast amount of SVO, but nevertheless, and I'm going to come back to this, there is quite a lot. You still find Germanic inversion, so you still find those orders where you get subjects which are post-verbal but demonstrably high in the T layer. And although I'm not going to talk about it today, you do get statistically significant matrix embedded asymmetries in Middle French. Nevertheless, you do get some indications that the system is changing when compared with some of the perhaps better studied verb second texts that we find in Old French. So some recent diachronic work has identified that the informational value of the preverbal constituent in the history of French actually changes quite significantly, and may also be partly motivated by stylistic factors, but undoubtedly there's a diachronic story there too. So it seems like focus fronting is particularly affected by this change. So when we look at these three texts, the majority of preverbal constituents are discourse old. And in fact, when you look at fronted preverbal complements, they actually have very, very strong morphosyntactic indicators of anaphoricity. So for example, in the example there, you have laquelle. But you often see, for example, that demonstrative pronouns are present there. So there are very clear markers. This is discourse old information. New information objects are really marginal in the texts in general, and almost all of them are QPs. So in the example 3 there, you have autre, others. And that's a fairly common pattern, which actually persists beyond the period we're talking about here. QPs seem to be very resilient to change in the focus system, and I might come back to that a little bit. Moving on to inversion, which we discussed earlier as a key verb second correlate. In Old French, you find between 17 and 35.5% of post-verbal subjects when you do an analysis of matrix clauses. So there is variation already in that period. When you look at these three texts here, they're slightly lower than those figures, but it's worth saying scholars who've looked at different texts have said there's stability in the overall amount of inversion. And I don't necessarily think these data really dispute that, nor is it necessarily the crucial factor at play. So let's say broad continuity here. But I do think there are a couple of crucial changes worth highlighting. So one point is that in the Middle French text, you see increasing pragmatic specialization of the Germanic inversion structures. So really what you find is post-verbal subjects which are either unambiguously discourse old or pronominal. And this is a continuation of a tendency that's already been observed in the literature in later Old French, where what you seem to see is increasing specialization of that high Germanic inversion position and increasing bleaching of the low Romance inversion position. So you get generalization of the type of post-verbal subjects which can occur low in the structure, and increasing pragmatic specialization of the subjects which occur high within the T layer. So we can sort of reflect a little bit on why this might be significant, because in G inversion structures, the high position of the post-verbal subject gives the acquirer a pretty strong indication that verb movement targets a C-related head. So if you see increasing specialization here, potentially that's a problem in terms of undermining some of that crucial evidence. I'm not claiming here at all that Romance inversion structures are incompatible with verb second, but ultimately the point is they're not as helpful in terms of leading the acquirer down a pathway of a verb second analysis of the data. So I'm now going to just reflect on a couple of other indications of change you see in Middle French. So one is the particle si. Now there's a very, very large philological and also formal literature on this particle in the history of French. And the account seems to be that it initially encodes topic continuity, but ends up being reanalyzed as an expletive, which is ultimately a sort of last resort verb second satisfier by probably the late 12th century. And I have an account of this, which worth saying some colleagues don't agree with, so it's not by any means uncontroversial, which is that what C does is it tracks the upwards reanalysis of verb second from fin to force. So it starts off as a fin P expletive and is reanalyzed as a force P expletive. Now, a crucial empirical observation is that there's a very small number of counterexamples, but generally speaking, from 1225 onwards, C is basically incompatible with fronted arguments of any kind. So what you see is you do get C used very extensively in later Old French, but you can kind of think of it as having a blocking effect on fronting of arguments which are typically focal and therefore perhaps more unambiguous indicators of being left peripheral. Crucially, C actually doesn't occur with very many post-verbal subjects either. So it may also have an effect in blocking input related to inversion. And the final point, empirical point I'm going to make about Middle French is the following. So in later Old French, which I'm not focusing on today, verb third is often viewed as a kind of exception to be explained. And even if you go back to manuals of Old French from the 1920s, which are written in very much a philological tradition, you will actually get a sort of exclusive list of adverbs and clause types which can trigger verb third. It's thought to be that restricted. And these findings are more or less confirmed by Ian Roberts and Barbara Vance in their fairly classic work on the history of French in the 90s, where they show it's a very small definable subclass of constituents which we would now locate very high in the left periphery, typically scene-setting adverbials and certain types of initial clauses that trigger verb third. Now, the really important observation is this is not the case in Middle French. We still find the later Old French structures, but what we also find is a reasonably large body of data, such as the types you've got in 6 and 7, where ultimately the first constituents in these orders, aqua in the first one, pour in the second one, are not straightforwardly scene setters or frame setters of any kind. So really what we're seeing, particularly if you look at 7, for example, is, and other examples like it, is potentially multiple argument fronting to the left periphery, which is really quite different to the phenomenon that we're observing in later Old French. So to summarize the kind of empirical picture, which is emerging here, the verb second property is lost within a century of the composition of all 3 texts. So in some ways we maybe shouldn't have, but we have a little bit of a bias, which is that we might be looking at these texts saying, well, what is it that might have undermined evidence for verb second, and do we see evidence of it? So we can then ask a slightly different question, which is, what is it that stands out about the nature of this dying verb second system, this late stage V2 system? Well, there are a few points. One is that there's undoubtedly a wider variety of constituents occurring in the left periphery and occurring pre-verbally than in most non-verb second systems. But there are also signs of increasing morphosyntactic and pragmatic specialization of the pre-field. So to give an example, if we zoom in on the focus field, QPs are licensed within the focus field, but other foci are very restricted. So when you do quantitative analysis of the type that has been done by people like Lebel and Hirschspuler and Devin Steiner, amongst others, you see that the proportion of focal constituents, both information focus and contrastive focus, declines quite markedly during the history of French. And we're ultimately seeing the culmination of that process. But QPs are very resilient. If we then switch to looking at the topic field, we see actually quite a similar story, which is that whereas in certainly early Old French, it's a very, very large class of topical constituents which can occur in initial position, we're now seeing it's quite a restricted class. It's typically, particularly in the case of objects which are unambiguously discourse old and have already been mentioned in the preceding portion of text or are pronominal. It's also worth saying there is a higher proportion of initial subjects in verb second clauses than is the case in Old French. We talked a little bit about the particle C, which is incompatible with fronted arguments and also typically post-verbal subjects as well. So you can see how that may well have undermined evidence for XP movement to the left periphery and verb subject inversion. we see this decrease in Germanic inversion relative to Romance inversion, but we also see something else which I think is quite significant, which is increasing specialization of Germanic inversion, which is very robust evidence of V to C movement or V to Fin movement, while Romance inversion is becoming more generalized. And then finally, we do see a lot of verb third of this, what we might call this naughty kind, which is not the kind we find in early Old French and later Old French. And I guess this might be a moment to reflect a little bit on why it might be problematic. And my suggestion, which I'm going to come back to at the very end, is the following. Middle French, given this extensive verb third, looks very much like a fin verb second rather than a forced verb second system. And it may well be that if you have a fin verb second grammar, which is naturally permissive of lots of verb third, but you couple that with the absence of extensive focus fronting, you end up with the kind of worst of both worlds. Because you've got lots of XP, XPV strings, which may well lend themselves towards a reanalysis as SVO. But what you haven't got are those consistent pieces of input from focus fronting, which are saying, actually, this constituent is high in your clausal structure, and it's adjacent to your finite verb. Okay, so I'm now going to move on and talk a little bit before I wrap up about later Old Veneton, which is there's been much less explored in the literature than Middle French. So previous approaches, there's a lot of literature actually on the Old Venetian text Leo Mazor, which has been used quite extensively, but far less about the Old Veneton corpus in general. Now, the modern Veneto shows extensive morphosyntactic microvariation. So the null hypothesis would surely be you would also expect to see variation in the medieval period. Now, there's fairly robust evidence that the verb second correlates are still present until the 15th century in quite a wide variety of texts. And I'm going to restrict myself today just to talking about 5, which are representative of Paduan, Venice, and also Veronese, where I have a single text there, which are 3 of the major dialect groups that you see within the Veneton region. Now, if we do the same analysis we did with Middle French, where you look at the initial constituents in verb second clauses, we see some quite interesting findings. And I should say here, some of these data are pretty small because some of the portion of text are in themselves quite small, or they have quite a lot of verb third, which is why there actually aren't that many verb second clauses to talk about. But I still think there are some interesting generalizations we can take away, keeping that caveat in mind. So one point is, if we look at the rate of initial subjects, actually, it's a relatively high proportion of SVO we're seeing here. So, so we have at one end, 74.3% of clauses having an initial subject in Lea Mazor. At the lower end, you've got 40.2% in the Thomasin, the Paduan text. And that observation actually sits with a parallel one, which is that fronting of objects in general and of internal arguments is in a number of texts really pretty sparse. So if you look, for example, at that first Paduan text edited by Thomasin, you've got 2 examples, admittedly out of quite a small corpus of only 97 clauses, but it's still potentially quite striking. You've only got 7 out of 300 in its sister text from the same dialect area, and larger numbers when you look at Leo Mazor, but nevertheless, within a comparative Romance context and with a comparative typological context, strikingly small numbers. Now, when we zoom in on those fronted objects and keep in mind what we found for Middle French, we actually see some quite striking parallels. So when you look at fronted objects in Venetian and Veronese, they are again strongly anaphoric. So very similarly to what we found for Middle French, you see a lot of questo, and a lot of initial pronominals as well. Now, when you look at focus fronting, you again see a very neat parallel with what we found in Middle French, which is that actually initial objects which are plausibly analysed as occupying positions within the focus field are essentially restricted to QPs. And there is a single example of contrastive focus, which I haven't given in Leo Mazor, which is reported by Beninka. But generally speaking, focus fronting, again, very restricted. When we then look at verb third patterns, we find variation between the texts. It's actually quite a complex picture, but summarizing, Leo Mazor is pretty strict. And I think this is interesting because then all the other texts are far less so. So it's a cautionary tale in a way for historical syntax about relying on a single text, as we largely have for the last 20 or 30 years, as being representative of a dialect area. And it's actually quite exceptional. Where when we look at a greater range of texts, we see examples like 11, ella sempre, where we have an initial pronominal followed by an adverbial, followed by the finite verb. And we get quite a lot of subject adverb verb cases in this text. And you have a parallel example there in 12. So which would fit under our naughty verb third definition. Now we also find C in some of these texts, but it's a very, very different picture to Middle French. And in some ways the inverse, whereas in French, C almost never occurs in Middle French with an initial XP, in a number of these texts, C near systematically occurs with initial subjects. So you get examples like 13, questo si è, this is, lo prevede si dis. So the priest said. Now, this isn't completely uniform across texts, but crucially, this pattern of initial subjects plus C is very widespread. And I'm going to come back to why that might be a problem. And then finally, inversion. Now, some of you will know that Jacopo Garzonio at the University of Padua and colleagues are working on a tagged corpus of Old Veneton, but it's not yet ready. So it's quite difficult to have really robust quantitative generalizations. But I have worked on a sort of very small pilot study of these texts. And actually the findings are fairly striking, even though it would be good to corroborate them on a fully tagged corpus. So actually, even though in classic accounts of Leo Mazor, it's shown to have Germanic inversion, if you look through the whole text, you actually only find 3 examples. So it's not very, very many. Germanic inversion is seemingly entirely absent in 2 of the texts, even though you get quite widespread attestation of post-verbal subjects in general. So although what we're not able to do is make the same fine-grained generalizations we can make about French, about the discourse pragmatic value of the subject in different contexts, what you can do is make quite a robust generalization, which is Germanic inversion, at least in some texts, is either heavily restricted or just not found. Romance inversion, still reasonably robust. So what does this kind of late stage or dying verb second system look like? So there are certain similarities actually to the situation in French, but some differences. So you see this restriction on topical objects basically needing to be strongly anaphoric, and also heavy restrictions on the focus field, very much like Middle French. We also see a high proportion of SVO relative to XPVS in a medieval Romance context, and we also see the widespread use of subject plus C. Now, I don't have time to talk about it today, but one important generalization is this sits alongside another characteristic of Old Veneton syntax, which is the extensive use of other types of expletives in the left periphery. And I'd like to suggest that if you take these 2 empirical observations together, what you're really seeing is an increasing preference for base generation strategies in the left periphery rather than internal merge. And that may be very, very significant when you think about the type of evidence you need to reconstruct a verb second grammar as a child. And then finally, very low attestation of Germanic inversion, and inversion in general seems to be pretty rare. And again, I realize it's not very pleasing from a scientific point of view to say seems at this stage because we don't have the tagged corpus. But when I talk to other researchers who are working with these texts, it is a fairly uniform observation. So as in French, finally, you may have this worst of both worlds scenario where for all the texts that except Leo Mazor, you seem to have a thin verb second system, but without all the inversion and without all the focus fronting to counterbalance that. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to try and say a few things about what the consequences of this picture are for our understanding of verb second loss and cartographic models of verb second loss. So what does a grammar about to lose verb second look like? Well, the first point is this. Actually, it seems to have a more specialized pre-field. In the classic V2 systems, we often talk about a maximally general probe located on the left peripheral head, which basically says attract any kind of category. And in fact, verb second is often a real problem to capture in certain probe goal agree terms, because you really aren't able to identify a very specific featural trigger for the movement. So if you're someone who says, well, actually, I don't really like EPP features in a generalized sense, or EFs or movement diacritics, I want all movement to be motivated and sort of have a specific probe. Verb second in general is a real problem for that. But actually, these late stage verb second grammars are rather different. We see notable restrictions on what you get in the topic and focus layers, and that suggests you have a more specialized probe. So whereas classic verb second may look a little bit like the example I've got in the middle of the slide, late stage verb second may look rather different, where ultimately what you're really getting is strongly anaphoric topical constituents in the left periphery, QPs, and possibly a small number of information foci. And I've sort of bracketed that to indicate not very much, that well-known technical term. A second observation is you see a very strong preference for base generation in general in the left periphery. So topics strongly outnumber foci, and you see increasing evidence, both direct and indirect, for base generated topics. So very well-known work on French by Tony Croc, among others, which shows that as the medieval period progresses, you see far fewer initial objects without clitic resumption and far more left dislocation with clitic resumption. Also, as I've suggested, there's a very large literature for the Venneton varieties, which suggests that you see a number of expletive pronouns in the left periphery satisfying verb second via merge. Now, what we think about this kind of interacts with an ongoing debate, which is actually how is verb second satisfied in general? Is it only satisfied via movement, which is what Anders Holmberg has claimed in a recent paper, or is it something where you can have base generated constituents satisfying verb second? And I've sort of tended towards that in a couple of things that I've written on this recently. But crucially, my point here is that the claim I'm making is that for you to have a stable verb second grammar, you do need a sufficient body of evidence for movement to the left periphery, and that the more base generated structures you have, actually it may lead to a decrease in those movement-based structures and then undermine the evidence for verb second. Naughty verb third, as I said, there is a bit of a problem here in that on the one hand, verb third and even verb fourth, fifth structures can be very stable in verb second systems over a considerable time span, but others clearly can pave the way towards an SVO reanalysis. So I basically like to differentiate between two types of verb third. One is resilient verb third, which might, for example, involve a frame setter, scene setter, or a left dislocate with a topic or focus. And that seems not to be a really undermining factor for verb second. Not in isolation, but alongside other factors, if you have constituents where you've got, say, multiple topics in the left periphery or topic plus focus orders, that may be rather different, and that may have the potential to render your system unstable. And then what about inversion? Well, I've made these empirical generalizations that you may see a decrease in inversion, in particular Germanic inversion, and you may also see specialization of this structure. I'm really trying to suggest here that actually it's not enough to just pay attention to whether you have inversion. You have to ask questions about what kind of inversion it is. And you might want to differentiate between two types. V2 reinforcing inversion, where the acquirer is receiving evidence from some source that your post-verbal subject is TP internal and your verb is therefore very high. And what may just be V2 neutral inversion, which is that your subject is maybe in the VP, or maybe you don't know where the subject is, which is not necessarily going to undermine evidence for verb second, but is not necessarily going to act as a massively reinforcing factor either. And why might these things be significant? I'm suggesting actually it's pretty simple. So if you look at the genesis of verb second in Romance and what we assume about that also in Germanic, we've put a lot of effort into trying to build a model of why would the acquirer come to the conclusion that they have sufficient evidence that XP fronting is not just a discourse or syntactically marked operation like it is in most modern Romance languages and say modern English, but actually obligatory. And why would the acquirer come to the conclusion that verb movement to fin or force is obligatory rather than just something that occurs in marked context? And basically, and apologies if this is overly simple, but I think it's an important intuition. My suggestion is that you lose verb second when all the evidence taken together by the child points to yields an insufficient body of data to say this is the case, and you need to postulate a maximally general movement rule for both phrasal and head movement. So when we look at those two components of verb second, the part that deals with XP fronting, actually two things are really problematic. One would be really specializing your pre-field, and another would be this preference for base generation. When you look at the head movement component, a high rate of SVO versus XPVS, and this potentially problematic verb third is really undermining some of the evidence you have that your verb is moving to a left peripheral position. So is any factor really decisive? Well, arguably not, because this is where I think comparative evidence becomes very important. Though they are not as permissive as they were at the full verb second stage, a lot of Southern Isler Romance varieties today, as well as potentially some Ibero-Romance grammars, though there's a lot of internal variation, as many of you will know, have pretty productive argument fronting. And it's the same for Romanian as well, but not to the same extent. But they still lose verb second. So losing argument fronting clearly isn't the whole story. Evidence from modern Germanic shows that verb second systems actually can vary in terms of the discourse pragmatic properties of the initial constituent. So Swedish is quite different to German, for example, in this respect, but still remain stable. And actually, a number of Romance fin verb second systems have quite widespread verb third. Now, if you treat the starting date for Romance verb second as potentially in the period where we get a number of late Latin texts, and you think then about the loss of verb second being maybe around the 16th century, that gives you at least a millennium of verb second, which is really a pretty stable property, but with quite a lot of verb third in some cases. And then finally, it is undoubtedly the case that if you have a null subject grammar and verb second, you're probably not going to have that much Germanic inversion and that much inversion potentially in general relative to a non-null subject language like modern German. And in fact, and this is a point that Cecilia Poletto makes in a recent paper on verb second loss, Cimbrian has actually survived for quite a long time as a verb second language without any Germanic inversion. So again, even though we have a tendency to kind of reify Germanic inversion as being really maybe the most important property for verb second acquirers, a language can survive without it. So what does this tell us about the notion of a field? Well, and its use in diachronic research? Well, we can kind of track the progression of formal insights into the verb second property as follows, with the questions we need to ask becoming increasingly granular. So you might have started by saying, once you have the CP hypothesis, well, verb second involves the CP. We then moved on for quite a long time saying verb second involves variation in an articulated C domain. And I'd like to say there's really a third stage needed there, where you say at the very least, late stage verb second involves variation in specific fields within an articulated C domain. So crucially then, these late stage verb second grammars can be sort of thought of as a transitional phrase from languages which have maximal amounts of movement to the left periphery and indeed to phase edges in general, to languages where they make far more use of external merge. And so this is in some ways kind of a return to merge over move in the sense of Robertson-Rousseau, or you can think of it as a decline in Ritzy's recent work on parameterization as a decline in the what he calls the IMF, the internal merge feature. But crucially, what we're seeing here is these languages, these grammars are kind of a bridge between languages which move a lot and languages which really move very little. So my overall conclusion is as follows. Dying Romance verb second systems have certain properties in common, and there's no exact overlap between them. And that probably suggests that no factor is decisive in undermining evidence for verb second. But it does seem that you need evidence to be undermined for both verb movement to the left periphery and fronting of constituents to the left periphery. This kind of suggests that we need to think about the factors undermining verb second, not in terms of a single magical cue, but in terms of a conspiracy of necessary factors, so that eventually you get this coalescence of properties where on the body of probabilities, the acquirer is not going to postulate verb second. And this, as I said, must affect both core components of the property. And finally, cartographic insights are actually really vital in helping us understand this fine-grained variation, both that we find synchronically, which I haven't really talked about that much today, but also diachronically as well. Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Thank you, Professor Wolfe, for the excellent lecture. I am sure that our audience enjoy your talk very much. Now I will read some of the questions we have received from our audience. If you haven't sent your question yet, please type them directly on the YouTube chat, or you can send an email to zoomnacartografia@gmail.com. And we are copying and pasting on our Zoom chat the question I am going to read for you. All right, so let's start with Cecilia Poletto. Cecilia Poletto sent us the following comment. This would mean that Samuel is right in assuming that verb second is the cumulation of several criterial positions. In the dying system, you lose some of them. I don't know if you would like to comment back. Yes.
Yeah, so I think in some ways what I might be claiming is slightly different, which is that I think that approach has a lot to offer for what you see in the very late stages, where it really does become very significant for the acquirer and ultimately us as the linguist to make very fine-grained distinctions between what can satisfy verb second and what can't. I guess I'm maybe a little bit more hesitant about saying earlier stages are not still triggered by just a generalized edge feature on fin or force. And then in the former case on fin, what you then do is move something higher up for it to get its discourse pragmatic reading.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if Cecilia Polet would like to come back. I don't know if she's here. I don't think so. So let's follow with a question. So a student from the La Casa Cartography group sent us the following question. Thank you, Professor Wolfe, for the wonderful talk. You mentioned the literature on the left periphery, which considers the importance of Focky projections to account for the verb second phenomenon. So in some verb second languages, licensing verb third or verb fourth, for example, early Old Sicilian, Occitan, Spanish, etc., V rising targets fin, and the phrasal constituent raises to spec fin to satisfy the edge feature of that projection. Further, that constituents raises to spec foc, and two other constituents are base generated in the specifiers of topicing frame. Which methodological clues have you identified in the corpus to state that the third phrase is focalized, considering that foci, for instance, are very restricted in larger stage of Romance, as mentioned before?
Yeah, so I think there's a sort of direct and an indirect answer to this question. So I think the direct one is that in cases where you get those sort of verb fourth patterns, ultimately people use different methodologies and different studies for how you identify what's a focus, what's a topic. It would, of course, be really nice if as a field we could all be very consistent in how we do that. And unfortunately, we're not, I think everyone would agree, we're not quite there yet. So I think it's, in that case, I think in a number of publications, I've used particular decision trees for information structural values. Of course, what's very nice is when, and there aren't that many around, but there are some, is when we have corpora, which are already tagged information structurally, because then you're not relying on a single person's judgment. This does raise an interesting issue, though, which has been discussed before. A number of the cases you get in some medieval Romance varieties, particularly the early ones, where you say get the verb in fourth position or in third position, which have, say, a subject followed by an object followed by the verb, are often analysed as topic plus focus. But if you assume that multiple topicalization is possible, they could potentially be that as well. And ultimately, sometimes there are not straightforward cues morphosyntactically, or if you read through the portion of text as to exactly what their value is. So I think there is some ambiguity there, and something which I think from a cartographic perspective would kind of be interesting to look at more within the medieval Romance languages is certain assumptions around a more fine-grained topic field, because a lot of work hasn't adopted that perspective, but it would make certain different predictions.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Now we have another question from a student from the next group. It's a question about the first example you gave in your presentation, that is in Old French, I think. The sentence « J'avoue avoir-t-il si longuement servi ?» And so the student asks, as for the data in 1 from Old French, one might be wondering whether the veau cliticized into the verb avoir or into the adverb ja when reaching the left periphery. So would the derivation of that sentence involve raising of veau cliticized to avoir, or is veau part of the same constituents as ja? What are the clues to infer that the verb is the second position in that sentence, therefore being the word veau a clitic or not, and not a phrasal constituent alone, leading to the third?
Yes, it's a really good question. I think that it's actually a badly chosen example, and it's not out of necessity, because this is quite a widespread phenomenon in Old French, where you get it with quite a lot of nominal subjects as well as pronominal subjects. There are certain diagnostics you can apply to post-verbal subject pronouns at this stage that show they probably aren't fully cliticized yet, although there is some controversy over the dating of exactly when subject clitics emerge in French, and whether you may even get decliticization and recliticization. So yeah, it's a very good question. It's not the best chosen example, but my underlying analysis of that would be it isn't cliticized. But the crucial point is that even if you assume that in an example like that, it's kind of special because you have got a subject clitic, you see lots of examples, certainly in Old French, where you have full nominal subjects as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Another student from the La Casa group just sent me this question. Hello, Prof. Wolfe. I've read some papers of yours and very interesting on the issues of complementizer movements left peripheral internally. So my question is, why in the realm of complementizer, we saw that the French child realized its merger directly in force instead of raising it from fin to force, internal merge? We saw that the realm of verb raising there has been a dismissing in the movement and not a merger in a higher head. Why should it be so?
Yes, I think this is a really nice question. So I think there's an assumption behind the question, which I think is correct, which is that when you see the upwards reanalysis of verb second in French from fin to force, which predates the period I've been talking about in the talk today, you also seem to see something else happening, which is you get far stricter asymmetries emerging, and building on some ideas that Phil Brannigan has in an MIT Press linguistic inquiry monograph about what he calls provocative syntax. I kind of built an analysis of that, where basically the idea is that you see upwards reanalysis, you see movement of the complementizer at the same time from fin to force, which is analogically conditioned by what's happening with verbs. So I think if I understand it correctly, the question is, if we then see downstairs reanalysis of verb movement and EPP effects, why are we not seeing the same happening with complementizers? And I don't have a really neat answer to that, to be honest. It may be, there may just be a basic cross-linguistic generalization, which is that it may well be that you don't get languages that don't have any high complementizer at all. That ultimately, maybe you see more variation lower in the left periphery with which head you spell out, but it may be that at that very high level, you always have some kind of subordinator present, so that almost it's a change that couldn't happen. But that's an off the top of my head answer to your question, which may turn out in due course to be stupid when I think about it a bit more.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question. A student from the NEC group just sent this question. From the 16th century onward, French becomes an SVO language, where neither fin nor force bears the EF or EPP feature, the locus for the EPP becoming the inflectional domain where the V rise to. Which type of information present in the input has been the main clue for the French child to develop a system different from the V-second system present at earlier stages? Would the direct merger of complementizers in force be a clue for this child in that period to set up parameters in a different fashion?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. So I mean, in terms of the potential, the build-up of information, it's very much along the lines of what I've suggested today. Pre-field specialization, move towards first merge structures rather than internal merge, changes to inversion properties, etc., an absence of focus fronting. I think the question about complementizers and whether they sort of feed into it at all is a really interesting one. Certainly, there's some publications which are really interesting ones by Cecilia Poletto and also Cecilia and colleagues arguing that the complementizer system may indeed be quite important clues towards how verb second functions. One of the things I didn't talk about today, but I have got data on, is that when you plot those Middle French texts diachronically, and then you try and do statistical tests on the strength of the asymmetry between clause types and how many non-subjects you see being fronted, you actually see the asymmetry weakening diachronically. So you get more and more symmetry between texts. And it's basically because you're getting more and more SVO in the main clauses rather than a rise in non-SVO in the embedded domain. So, I mean, I think if you adopt degree zero learnability, and you work on the assumption that kids only work from main clauses, then ultimately what's going on in the embedded clause may not be that helpful to you as the acquirer. I guess if you don't adopt degree zero learnability, and I do tend to, you might come up with an analysis where you say, well, kind of having less of an asymmetry is that children might pick up on the asymmetry and that might tell them something.
Okay, all right. Since there seems to be no more question from our audience, I would like to know if someone here in the Zoom room want to ask a question to Professor Sam. Just turn on your microphone and camera and ask him directly, please. Is there anyone?
Charlotte.
Yeah.
Hi, Sam. Nice
Hi,
to meet
Charlotte.
you.
Nice to see you.
I have 3 comments for you to comment, please. The first one is that maybe we could think of the 2 kinds of V2 languages, not in terms of the head to which the verb raises, but whether the movement of the phrase is a formal one or a discourse motivated one. So I'm thinking very much of Fry's analysis for German. He says that German has both, in fact. And I think that Romance languages have only the discourse-motivated movement. And maybe this discourse-motivated movement is more prone to die than the former one. This would be my first question for you. My second comment is about Portuguese. I think that you should look at Portuguese. Because first, Portuguese remained as a V2 language more time. Yeah. So we have a lot of texts from the 16th and 17th century. And I've been thinking a lot about the problem of focus and topic. And is it a focus? Is it a topic? And there was a question in this sense now. And I've been suggesting that there is a position for Portuguese at least, but I think that it could be served for other languages, which is neither topic nor focus. And that I called contrast. But it is not a contrastive topic. It is not either a contrastive focus. It's only a position which is more salient, in fact. And it is very frequently anaphoric, in fact, also. And in Portuguese, there's something which is extremely interesting. It is clitic placement, because according to what you have before the verb, you can have proclisis or enclisis. And I think this makes a difference. And so this happened also in Old Romance languages, and Beninka spoke about that. And I think that old ideas about that are very interesting and can be reformulated now with the cartography. And the third comment is, what about prosody? Because the first explanation, and which influenced me very much, was Adams. About Old French, so you didn't mention it, and I think that it is a good candidate for the loss of V2 in Portuguese, the change in rhythm. So these are my three comments, and
yes,
and
so
I thank you for the very nice talk.
No, very welcome, and definitely, I'd already observed some of the parallels between your work on Portuguese and what was stemming out here independently. So I think on the first point, I haven't traditionally worked using Fry's system, but I do think the core intuitions are comparable in that really what I'm trying to claim is that if you like, the gap between an SVO system with marked XP fronting is less and a verb second system with very specific types of XP which can satisfy verb second but which nevertheless always need to be fronted is smaller than one where you have a verb second system where basically anything goes in the left periphery, simplifying a little bit. And I think in some ways that is important. And I think you can think about it. I hadn't mentioned it today, but you can also think about it, I think, in terms of kind of parametric typology, that if you look at the types of things which can be focalized or topicalized in certain modern Romance languages, you can sometimes even lexically specify, as you know, as a French speaker, you can lexically specify things that can be fronted in contemporary French and things that can't. And that's even kind of further along the line than the cases we're talking about here, where you've got a syntactically defined class, but it's a narrower class than the class you have before. And I think one of the really interesting questions is trying to establish how much cross-linguistic commonality there is in the pathways you go through in terms of starting with kind of any kind of topic to maybe weakly anaphoric to strongly anaphoric, and seeing whether that holds up across multiple languages. And this, I think, relates to your second question about Portuguese, which is that, yes, I completely agree. It would be very nice to look at it, and it was something I'd be very happy to talk to you about more. And then the final point, prosody, yes. And I think one can definitely see if, as seems to be the case. The focus system is really pretty significant here. One can particularly see how things like stress patterns could be really influential in triggering change. With the clitics, those unfortunately in this case are trickier as diagnostics, because French, from almost the earliest textual attestations, you just get enclasis in V1 structures, but not in V2 structures. So you don't get that nice alternation of the kind Beninka indicated, where you get a certain type of initial constituent with enclasis and the verb and a different type. And actually in the Veneton text as well, it's very, very rare. We've tried to find cases where you get XP, verb, enclasis, and they're almost none. But thanks, I'm going to need to think a bit more about some of your questions as well.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to ask question to Professor Sam?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here, listen to you. I have a few comments I wrote because my English is not good. The first, I believe that the explanation for the loss of V2 must always be taken individually, considering Lightfoot's reflections on language acquisition as the place of the change in Q theory. I'm saying that each language could have an individual plan for the loss of the two. Second, I think the scale of the two laws you presented is very interesting, but Beatriz Santorini and Carolina Medeiros offer contradictory evidence for this scale. Santorini says that Yiddish was an asymmetrical V2 language and became a symmetric language, and Carolina Medeiros claims that opposite for the Portuguese. Carolina proposed that Old Portuguese was a symmetrical V2, and the classical Portuguese was an asymmetrical V2. In the case of Spanish, I thought the citation of Cho's 1907 PhD dissertation that medieval Spanish was an asymmetrical language, V2 language. The PhD dissertation is stuck in the university library, and I didn't have access to it. But in my PhD dissertation in 2011, I found the same results of Fontana's analysis, that the change from symmetrical V2 to non-V2 and the Spanish didn't pass by the intermediate stage unsymmetrical V2. I would like to come back to this question, to this reason after. Regarding Spanish, I proposed Saiz Pinto 2011 that the trigger for the loss of V2 was the reduction of the OV order without clitics, with varied with clit cleft dislocation. In my data, OV order without clit vary with clit cleft dislocation. After 16th century, I only find OV order with the use contemporary use with focus, without topics and neutral object fronted. So I think the biggest evidence for the child acquiring V2 in the medieval Spanish is the possibility of fronted any kind of object, and as consequence, they can move the verb and have other construction like object shift, auxiliaries, and principal verb with subject space between them and others. Okay, finally, I reviewed the typology of V2 language in my PhD dissertation in 2011, proposing precisely V2 for analysis for asymmetrical language, and V2 Fin for symmetrical language. But my work is in Portuguese, so we can't dialogue because the lecture is hard to the international reader. I have some more questions, but we can talk via email. Thank you for your interesting talk about V2.
No, thanks for all your questions. I think I may fail to answer all of them, but so I think the point about the proposed sort of the proposed diachronic progression to late stage. Firstly, I'm not wedded to the idea that you go thin, force, and what I'm proposing here. And crucially, I'm suggesting here you have a downwards reanalysis again, at least in the case of French, to thin. I think with the relation with asymmetry and symmetry, I've worked a little bit also on trying to make a connection between force V2 systems being more asymmetric and thin V2 systems being more symmetrical. And I think that's quite intuitive of what we observed today. But again, there may be complications there typologically, and I wouldn't necessarily rule those out. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, there was a bit of a fixation in some of the acquisitional literature in the 80s and 90s with the idea of non-ambiguous input. And of course, the problem when you look at potential input strings is almost all of them are ambiguous in some way. But undoubtedly, you can posit a sort of continuum where there are strings that really are very, very, very ambiguous and strings which on balance are less so. And clearly those with object fronting, and particularly if you have a high post-verbal subject, are at the extreme end of being, if you like, V2 beneficial. So I think I agree entirely on that point. And I think the data from Middle French and Veneton also support that point, in that you see a very marked decline in the number of objects that you see fronted, but also the increasing specialization in terms of their properties.
Okay, thank you very much. Sandra, Achilles, would you like to say some words so we can wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sam, for being here with us and for this very, really interesting lecture opening to, our 2023 series of Zoom na Cartografia conference. Thank you so much. This is a joint project by two research groups doing syntactic cartography, namely La Casa at Unicamp and NEG at UFSC. And it is also a pleasure for us to announce our next speaker, Nicola Munaro, from the Ca' Foscari University of Venice, who is going to give a lecture entitled Non-Integrated Conditionals as Sentential Speech Act Modifiers, Evidence from Romance, on the 6th of June at midday Brazilian time, 3 p.m. UK time, 4 p.m. Italy time, and 11 p.m. Beijing time, and midnight of the next day in Tokyo. Thank you, Sam, again. And
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, and especially thank you, Professor Charlotte Galvis and Professor Carlos Felipe Pinto for being here with us in the Zoom room. Thank you so much. And Achilles?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sam, for this thought-provoking talk. We love it and learned a lot from you. I will send you an email with a question as we are pushed for time. I also would like to thank two colleagues who are here with us in the Zoom room today, as Sandra already said. Professor Charlotte Galvis from Unicamp, a leading syntactician who has contributed a lot on the grammars of Portuguese and on diachronic syntax with her important research group, Chico Brahe here from Unicamp. Thank you, Charlotte. And also many thanks to Professor Carlos Felipe Pinto from the Federal University of Bahia, one of the most important names on cartographic studies here in Brazil. He's also known from his work on left periphery, V2 in the history of Spanish and the grammars of Spanish. Thank you, Carlos, for being here with us. And thanks Sandra Quarez Emin, Isa Flood, João, Letícia Crick, Gabriel Floch, and Raquel for all the support in the organization of this event. Please, Sam, could you stay here a second? Our students wanna take a pic with you as usual. Thank you and long life to syntactic cartography.
Charlotte e Carlos também, fiquem aqui.